Calamity Jane. What DNA would really reveal about the Old West's most famous woman? Calamity Jane is one of the most famous names of the Old West. Her story has been told in dime novels, Hollywood westerns, and tourist brochures for over a century. But the truth behind that story is way messier than the movies ever suggested. For decades, people have claimed there's a hidden family secret tied to her. The rumor that keeps coming back again and again is that she had a secret child with Wild Bill Hickok, a daughter hidden from history, raised in secrecy, carrying the blood of two legends. So here's the real question. If DNA could speak, what would it actually confirm? And what would still be impossible to prove? In this deep dive, we'll look at the evidence that exists. We'll examine the famous claim that fell apart under scrutiny. We'll explore why testing anything from a 1903 grave in Deadwood isn't as simple as people think. And we'll confront the uncomfortable truth about what DNA can and cannot tell us, about a woman who spent her life blurring the line between fact and fiction. Because Calamity Jane wasn't just a character in the Wild West story, she was one of its first and most successful creators. Number 1. Myth versus paperwork. Calamity Jane is one of those Old West names that feels like it should come with a neat timeline and a clean backstory. The kind of name that belongs on a wanted poster or a monument, where every date is certain and every achievement is documented. Then you look closer, and the paperwork turns into a fight. Her real name was Martha Jane Canary, sometimes spelled Connery, because 19th century records weren't exactly consistent about spelling. Even her birth year is debated in reputable sources. You'll see 1852 in some places and 1856 in others. That sounds like a small detail, a minor discrepancy that only matters to historians and genealogists. But it shifts everything. It changes how old she was during almost every famous episode people attach to her. It affects whether she could have been where she claimed to be when she claimed to be there. A 4-year gap doesn't sound like much until you're trying to place a 15-year-old versus a 19-year-old in a frontier railroad camp, or a 20-year-old versus a 24-year-old riding with scouts and soldiers. The same problem shows up with her job titles: scout, teamster, nurse, performer, camp follower. The list goes on. And each title comes with its own set of assumptions about who she was and what she did. Some parts of her story are supported by records and contemporary reporting, newspaper mentions, military documents, census records that place her in specific places at specific times. Other parts come from later retellings that got smoother every time they were repeated. That's exactly why the idea of Calamity Jane's DNA keeps grabbing attention. DNA feels like a final answer. It feels like it can cut through 100 years of rumors, tall tales, and Hollywood embellishments in one clean lab report. Science doesn't exaggerate. Science doesn't have an agenda. Science just reports what it finds. But here's the thing. There isn't a widely published, officially verified DNA test of Calamity Jane's remains that settles the big questions people argue about. A lot of online posts and YouTube videos talk like the test already happened, like scientists dug up the grave in Deadwood and delivered a verdict that confirms everything we suspected. When you go looking for an actual lab report, a court record, or a peer-reviewed paper, you find something else. You find the same rumor repeated with new wording, the same claim recycled without evidence, the same hope masquerading as fact. What we actually have is a mix of historical documents, some solid, some sketchy later claims that were challenged and largely discredited, and modern DNA science that shows what would be possible if the right samples and the right comparisons existed. The gap between possible and actual is where this story lives. From there, the story becomes less about a single shocking reveal and more about how the Wild West turned messy lives into clean myths. Calamity Jane didn't just live in that system. She became one of its most famous products. She learned early that a good story could feed you, clothe you, and keep you alive in ways that hard work never could. And she never stopped telling stories right up to the end. Number 2. The girl behind the nickname. Most historians agree on the broad outline of her early life, even if the details get fuzzy around the edges. Martha Jane Canary was born in Missouri, near the town of Princeton, in either 1852 or 1856. Her family moved west during the 1860s, part of the massive migration that followed the Civil War, when thousands of families packed their belongings into wagons and headed for opportunities they couldn't find back east. In the usual telling, her mother died along the way. Cholera, maybe. Exhaustion, possibly. The records aren't clear. Her father died not long after, leaving the children without parents while they were still young. Martha was maybe 14, maybe 12, depending on which birth year you trust. Either way, she was too young to be alone and too old to be easily adopted into another family. By the late 1860s, Martha was in Wyoming Territory, moving around the railroad and military post world that sprang up along the Union Pacific. The Transcontinental Railroad was being built, and that meant camps, construction sites, supply depots, and all the chaos that comes with thousands of men working far from home. That environment mattered. Frontier towns and railroad camps weren't gentle places. They didn't offer many stable options, especially for a teenage girl without family support. Work could mean laundry, cooking, serving drinks, caring for animals, or whatever paid that week. It could also mean things that didn't make it into the family newspapers. Some accounts say she worked around saloons and dance halls. Some say she sometimes dressed in men's clothing. Whether that started as a practical choice, easier to work, safer to move around, or a disguise or a performance trick, it became part of her public identity. She didn't fit the usual frontier woman template. She wasn't a school teacher, a farmer's wife, or a respectable mother raising children in a sod house. She was something else entirely. The nickname Calamity Jane is another piece that refuses to stay settled. One popular story says an officer, Captain James Egan, gave it to her after she helped him during a fight near Goose Creek, Wyoming in 1873. The story goes that she pulled him out of danger and he said something like, "You're a calamity, Jane, but you saved my life." Other stories say she used the name herself, or that it began as a warning because trouble followed her wherever she went. Calamity fit because calamity was what happened when she showed up. What's consistent is that once the name existed, it made everything louder. Martha Canary sounds like a private person, someone you might pass on the street without noticing. Calamity Jane sounds like a character, and characters are easier to sell. That distinction, which shaped the rest of her life. Number 3. How dime novels made people immortal. The late 19th century had its own version of viral media, sensational newspapers that competed for readers with ever more outlandish headlines, touring shows that brought authentic Western figures to audiences in New York, Chicago, and beyond, and dime novels cheap, mass-produced paperbacks that turned real people into larger-than-life figures. The American public wanted scouts, cowboys, lawmen, and outlaws. They wanted stories of adventure and danger, of narrow escapes and dramatic showdowns. And publishers wanted names they could reuse, characters that would sell, regardless of whether the details matched reality. Calamity Jane fit perfectly. She was unusual, a woman in a man's world. She was visible. She showed up in places where people took notice, and she was willing to talk, willing to tell stories, willing to be whatever the audience needed her to be. Over time, her reputation expanded into a menu of Old West facts that weren't always facts. She was described as a fearless scout who rode with famous military units, a bullwhacker who drove freight teams across dangerous territory, a crack shot who could outshoot any man in the territory, a kind of rough heroine who could outdo men at their own game while still being, somehow, a romantic figure. Some of those roles are plausible. She did move through the same spaces as soldiers and workers. She did travel constantly, covering hundreds of miles across multiple territories. She would have learned to handle animals, to shoot, to survive in conditions that killed plenty of people who weren't prepared. But plausible is not the same as proven, and Calamity's own storytelling didn't help separate the two. She was known for tall tales. She'd tell stories about her adventures that grew with each telling, adding details, embellishing dangers, making herself the hero of situations that might have been much more ordinary. And once a good story landed in print, it could travel farther than any person ever could. A story printed in a newspaper in Cheyenne could be reprinted in San Francisco, St. Cud, Louis, and New York within weeks. A story in a dime novel could reach hundreds of thousands of readers who would never set foot west of the Mississippi. In 1896, a short pamphlet called Life and Adventures of Calamity Jane by herself was printed as part of a touring show connected to an amusement company. Many researchers believe it was written with help, basically dictated to someone else, and shaped into a marketable narrative. It's not an autobiography in the modern sense. It's closer to a promotional brochure, a tool for selling tickets. The pamphlet is important because it shows how Calamity marketed herself. It's not a courtroom statement under oath. It's not a diary written for private reflection. It's a public performance designed to give audiences what they wanted. But it mixes real places and names with bragging and myth-making, which means researchers have to pick through it carefully, trying to separate what might be true from what was probably invented. The same city of Deadwood timeline that scholars use also sketches what her fame looked like in real life. It lists her touring with Cole and Middleton in 1896. It places her performing at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York in 1901. It even notes a marriage to Clinton Burke, often spelled Burke in 1891, which helps explain why some documents and later reprints attach the surname Burke to her. Those details don't prove the wildest stories people tell about her, but they do show how she kept moving, kept performing, and kept selling the Calamity Jane name right up to the end. Once her image became profitable, the line between who she was and what audiences wanted her to be got thinner and thinner. By the time she died, it might have disappeared entirely. That's the heart of the DNA obsession. People want a tool that can't be sweet-talked, exaggerated, or rewritten. A tool that can cut through all the performance and tell us who she really was. But DNA doesn't work that way either. Number 4, Deadwood's real setting. If Calamity Jane has a center stage, it's the Black Hills and Deadwood. And that setting is the real engine of her legend. Without Deadwood, she might be a footnote and interesting character, but not an icon. Deadwood was founded during the gold rush of 1876. That single year transformed a remote corner of South Dakota into one of the most famous places in American history. Prospectors poured in by the thousands, convinced they'd find their fortune in the streams and hills. Saloons, gambling halls, and brothels opened as fast as buildings could be thrown up. The population exploded from nothing to thousands in a matter of months. It also sat in a politically charged place. Under the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, the Black Hills were part of Lakota territory. The land had been guaranteed to the Lakota people for as long as the grass shall grow and the rivers shall flow. But then gold was discovered, and those guarantees meant nothing. The rush of miners into the region helped drive conflict, broken promises, and long-term consequences that didn't end with the Wild West era. The U.S. government eventually seized the land, provoking wars that cost thousands of lives. The Black Hills remain a source of contention to this day, with the Lakota people still fighting for what was taken. This is where the phrase Native American history stops being a side note and becomes the main backdrop, because the Black Hills were never just an empty stage for miners and gunfighters. They were and are a sacred place, central to Lakota spirituality and identity. The story of Deadwood can't be told without acknowledging what was destroyed to make it possible. In a boomtown like Deadwood, the usual boundaries blur fast. People come from everywhere. Some are prospectors chasing the dream of striking it rich. Some are gamblers, following the money that flows through saloons and card tables. Some are working people chasing wages, cooks, laundresses, laborers, teamsters. Some are opportunists chasing chaos, looking for the main chance in a place where rules don't apply. That's where the classic Old West cast forms, outlaws looking for easy money and lawmen trying to impose order, often with limited authority and a lot of politics behind them. Deadwood later became linked with famous lawmen like Seth Bullock, who arrived after the initial chaos and helped turn the camp into a real town. But early on, the town's law was often informal, built on quick decisions and local power. If you had a gun and the nerve to use it, you could make your own rules. Even the cemeteries tell you how improvised the town was. Deadwood's earliest burial ground was later relocated to the hills at Mount Moriah in the late 1870s. Bodies were dug up and moved, sometimes carefully, sometimes not. Not every grave was handled perfectly. That's not gossip, it's part of why modern archaeology and modern DNA work have shown up in Deadwood history at all. When unidentified remains were found near the old cemetery area years later, scientists and historians worked together to learn who that person might have been before reinterment. They use modern forensic techniques to estimate ancestry, approximate age, even probable physical traits. It was careful, documented, scientific work, the exact opposite of the rumor mill that usually surrounds Deadwood's famous figures. Calamity Jane's timeline intersects with this world in a few key ways. The City of Deadwood timeline says she joined the Newton-Jenny expedition to the Black Hills in 1875 without proper authority, which meant she was forced to return. She wasn't supposed to be there, but she went anyway. That's very Calamity Jane. It also places her heading toward the hills in 1876, with figures who became Deadwood legends, including Wild Bill Hickok and Colorado Charlie Utter. That's the journey that would define her legacy. Then, in 1878, the same local timeline credits her with nursing people during a smallpox outbreak in the Black Hills. In 1879, it lists her working as a bullwhacker, driving teams between towns like Pierre, Fort Pierre, and Rapid City. Whether you see those as heroic acts or just hard work, they're the kind of details that make her feel real, not just cinematic. She was there, doing things, living through the same hardships as everyone else. She wasn't just a character in a story. She was a person who got things done. Number 5. Wild Bill and Jane. Wild Bill Hickok is the strongest magnet in Calamity Jane's story. Without him, she's a fascinating frontier figure. With him, she becomes part of a legend that transcends the Old West entirely. Hickok was already famous as a lawman and gunfighter before he reached Deadwood. He'd been a scout during the Civil War, a marshal in Kansas, a star of Wild West shows, and the subject of countless dime novels. His name brought instant drama to any town he entered. When he rode into Deadwood in the summer of 1876, everyone knew who he was. He arrived with other well-known figures, including Colorado Charlie Utter, who would later arrange his funeral. He stayed only a short time, a few weeks at most, before he was killed on August 2, 1876, in Deadwood's No. 10 saloon. Jack McCall walked up behind him and shot him in the back of the head. Hickok was holding the poker hand that would forever be known as the dead man's hand, aces and eights. The hard evidence for a romantic relationship between Hickok and Calamity Jane is thin, really thin. Some historians argue they were casual acquaintances at best. They moved in the same circles, knew the same people, spent time in the same places. But romantic partners? There's no contemporary documentation that supports it. Even Calamity's own 1896 pamphlet frames the connection more like friendship than marriage. She mentions him, certainly, but she doesn't claim the kind of relationship that later storytellers would invent. But the public didn't need strong evidence, because one decision after Calamity's death did most of the storytelling for them. She was buried next to Hickok at Mount Moriah Cemetery in Deadwood after she died in 1903. That burial has competing explanations. One line of tradition says it matched her dying wish that she wanted to spend eternity next to the man she loved. Another tradition says the men who planned her funeral placed her there as a posthumous joke, because Hickok supposedly had no use for her while he was alive and would have hated being stuck next to her for eternity. Either way, the result is the same. Two graves side by side created a permanent visual narrative. You don't have to read a book to understand the implication. You don't have to study historical documents. You stand there looking at those two markers, and the story writes itself. People assume romance. They assume love. They assume a connection that may never have existed. The details of her final days also get wrapped into the legend. The City of Deadwood timeline says she died on August 1, 1903, in Terry, South Dakota, at the Callaway Hotel. The cause is listed as a combination of inflammation of the bowels and pneumonia. Those aren't movie-friendly words. They don't sound heroic or romantic. They sound like what they are: a real person getting sick, wearing down, and dying far from the dramatic scenes later writers preferred. She was 51 if you use the later birth year, 47 if you use the earlier one. Either way, she was worn out. The frontier had taken everything she had. There's also a famous photograph from 1903 showing Calamity Jane at Hickok's grave. It was taken by photographer John B. Mayo, and it's one of the most reproduced images in Western history. An old woman, clearly ill, standing next to a grave marker, looking down at the final resting place of the man she supposedly loved. It's an image that feels like proof, like evidence of a love story that transcended death. Except a photograph can't tell you what the relationship actually was. It can't tell you whether she was there out of love or out of a sense of obligation or out of a performer's instinct to create one last powerful image. And once movies got involved, the story hardened. Early films and later westerns leaned into the romance because it made the plot smoother. It gave audiences something to root for, something to feel. Smooth plots are exactly what Calamity's real life never provided. Her actual story is full of gaps, contradictions, and moments that don't fit neatly into any narrative. But the movies don't care about that. They care about what works. Number 6. The daughter claim. This is where DNA becomes the obvious next step, because the biggest claim tied to Calamity Jane isn't just romance, it's parentage. In 1941, a woman named Jane McCormick publicly claimed she was the biological daughter of Calamity Jane and Wild Bill Hickok. She said there had been a marriage in Montana Territory in 1873, conducted by a priest, witnessed by people whose names she provided. She said Calamity had left behind a diary and letters addressed to Janie, her childhood nickname. It was a perfect story for the era. It turned Calamity from a rough frontier figure into a hidden mother, a woman with secrets and sacrifices. It turned Hickok from a lonely gunman who died young into a father who never knew his child. It gave the Old West something it barely had, a genuine, verifiable, heart-tugging family saga. The claims spread because people wanted it to be true. Writers and filmmakers were eager for any lost chapter that made these legends feel more human. If Calamity and Wild Bill had a secret daughter, that changed everything. That made them real, in a way that gunfights and saloon stories never could. The problem is that the claim came with serious issues. Timelines didn't line up well with what's known about Hickok's life. He was in specific places during specific periods, and Montana Territory in 1873 wasn't one of them. The supposed documentary proof the diary, the letters, didn't survive careful scrutiny. A major point in modern scholarship is that the diary and letters tied to the McCormick story were shown to be unreliable and likely fraudulent. Historian James D. McLaird is often credited with dismantling the claim in detail. His research showed inconsistencies, anachronisms, and outright impossibilities in the materials McCormick produced. Later historical writing has described the McCormick materials as a fraud that shaped popular culture for decades, influencing books, films, and even museum exhibits. Anyway, this matters because the DNA question is basically the modern version of that old argument. The documents were treated like a secret key that would unlock the truth. When the documents collapsed under scrutiny, people started dreaming about genetics as the new key. The desire is the same, a clean answer that ends the debate. Proof that doesn't depend on unreliable memories or self-serving claims. Science as the ultimate arbiter of truth. But the past doesn't usually cooperate like that, especially when the debate has been fueled by entertainment for so long. By the time Jane McCormick made her claim, Calamity Jane had already been a character in movies, books, and shows for decades. The line between historical figure and fictional creation was already blurred beyond recognition. Even the way the story shows up in movies proves the point. Once the romance idea took hold, films kept reinforcing it. Doris Day played Calamity Jane in a 1953 musical that had nothing to do with historical reality but everything to do with what audiences wanted. Howard Keel played Wild Bill, and they sang duets and fell in love, and it was all very entertaining and completely made up. That reinforcement made the romance feel like common sense. It's not hard to see why people hear Calamity Jane and instantly expect a hidden marriage, a hidden child, and a hidden truth waiting in the grave. The story has been told so many times that it feels like fact. But feeling like fact and being fact are two different things. Number 7. What DNA would need now for the part that usually gets skipped in the hype? DNA testing isn't a magic truth ray. It's not like the movies, where a technician runs a sample through a machine and a screen flashes match found in dramatic letters. It's a method with strict requirements, and if you don't meet them, the result can be useless or misleading. To test anything meaningful about Calamity Jane, you would need a verified biological sample from her. That almost always means teeth or bone from her remains. Teeth are particularly valuable because their enamel protects DNA from contamination better than other tissues. Bone can work too, especially dense bones like the femur, but only if they've been properly preserved. Hair can work sometimes. DNA can survive in hair follicles, and there are plenty of locks of hair claimed to be from famous historical figures. But hair works only if it's truly hers and handled correctly, which is a huge if in Old West artifact culture. People have been collecting authentic hair from famous people for centuries, and most of it can't be verified. Then you'd need a verified comparison sample. If the question is, was Jane McCormick her child? You'd need Jane's DNA or DNA from a direct descendant. Jane died in 1975, but if she had children or grandchildren, their DNA could be used for comparison. If the question is, Was Wild Bill the father? It gets even harder. You'd need Hickok's DNA, which means exhuming his grave, and a way to compare it to a known family line. Hickok had relatives, so it's theoretically possible, but you'd need their cooperation, their DNA, and a clear chain of descent. Different types of DNA answer different questions. Mitochondrial DNA follows the mother's line. It's passed from mother to all her children, but only daughters pass it on. If you had mitochondrial DNA from Calamity Jane and from someone claiming descent through her daughter, you could potentially confirm the maternal line. Y chromosome DNA follows the father's line. It's passed from father to son, which means it's useless for questions about daughters. If the hidden child was female, Y DNA tells you nothing. Autosomal DNA is the mixed DNA you get from all ancestors. It's what consumer tests like 23andMe analyze. It can identify relationships up to about 5 or 6 generations back, but it requires good reference samples and becomes less reliable the further back you go. Each kind answers different questions. None of them can do miracles if the family lines and the documentation are a mess, and all of them require something that's often missing in historical cases, a clear chain of custody for the samples. This is why examples matter. In 1995, the outlaw Jesse James was exhumed for DNA testing as part of a long-running identity controversy. People had claimed for decades that the man buried as Jesse James was actually someone else, that Jesse had faked his death and lived under another name. The exhumation and later scientific work using mitochondrial DNA from living descendants supported the identification of the remains as Jesse James. The myth was finally put to rest. That kind of test doesn't happen by accident. It happens because researchers define the question clearly, collect the right material with proper documentation, and compare it to the right relatives with records backing up the chain of custody. It takes years of work, cooperation from multiple parties, and a lot of money. Deadwood itself offers another example of what modern forensic DNA can do with old remains. Scientists working with an unidentified set of remains found near the town's original cemetery used modern DNA sequencing to estimate ancestry and even probable physical traits like hair and eye color. They were able to learn things about a person whose name will never be known, where their ancestors came from, what they might have looked like. Then they reinterred that individual at Mount Moriah with dignity. A technical summary of that kind of work describes using a modern approach that reads many DNA fragments at once, which helps with old, degraded samples. It's impressive, but it's also controlled and documented. Every step is recorded. Every result is verified. That's the standard you'd need before you could claim you'd solved anything about Calamity Jane. So if someone says, Calamity Jane's DNA proved the secret, the first question is simple. Where did the verified sample come from? And where is the documented test result? If the answer is vague or based on "someone told me," you're dealing with rumor, not science. Number 8. Why graves stay closed. Even if the science is possible, the grave is the roadblock. And for good reasons. Exhumation is not a casual choice. It's not like deciding to dig up your backyard to plant a tree. It involves laws, courts, cemetery rules, and often the wishes of communities that treat these graves as historic and personal at the same time. Mount Moriah isn't just a burial ground. It's a landmark. It's part of Deadwood's public history, visited by thousands of tourists every year who come to see the graves of Wild Bill and Calamity Jane. There's also a long track record of people treating famous graves like souvenir stops instead of resting places. Historical accounts around Mount Moriah describe decades of tourist damage to monuments at Wild Bill's gravesite. People chipped pieces off the original markers as souvenirs. They carved their names into nearby surfaces. Protections had to be added over time just to preserve what was left. When a site has that history, officials and locals tend to be cautious about any proposal that involves digging, even for science, even with the best intentions, because once you open a grave, you can't unopen it. And if the process isn't handled perfectly, you've disturbed a historic site for nothing. On top of that, there's the risk of a pointless disturbance. If the remains are too degraded, if the South Dakota soil and weather have done their work over more than a century, DNA might not be recoverable. If contamination has mixed modern DNA into the sample from handling, from groundwater, from countless visitors walking nearby, you can end up with an inconclusive result after you've already disturbed the grave. That's a lose-lose situation. The myth stays exactly where it was. The science doesn't deliver anything definitive. and a burial site that's been respected for over 100 years is disrupted for no gain. And even if DNA did produce a clear answer about biological relationships, it still wouldn't answer the softer questions people actually argue about, like whether two people had a romantic relationship, or what they meant to each other, or whether a child was loved or hidden or abandoned. DNA can tell you who was related to whom. It can't tell you what that relationship felt like. So the resistance to exhuming Calamity Jane isn't necessarily about hiding a secret. It's about balancing respect, legality, and the very real chance that the test doesn't give the dramatic payoff people expect. It's about recognizing that some questions can't be answered by science, no matter how advanced the technology gets. Number 9, artifacts and loose ends. Because exhumation is so sensitive, people look for another way in. Objects, artifacts, things that might carry Calamity Jane's DNA without requiring the grave to be opened. Archives and collections exist that include materials connected to the John McCormick claim, copies of the supposed diary and letters, other related items preserved as historical material. On paper, that sounds like a DNA shortcut. If the diary has hair follicles stuck between pages, or if a letter was sealed with saliva, there might be recoverable DNA. In reality, it's a trap. Old objects are easy to mislabel and hard to prove. A lock of hair might have been handled by dozens of people over decades. It might have been stored in conditions that degraded any DNA beyond use. It might be genuine, or it might be someone's well-intentioned imitation. Or it might be real hair, but not from the person the seller claimed. Even if DNA could be recovered from an object, you still have to prove the DNA belongs to the right person and not to a later handler. That requires strict lab controls and a proven chain of custody, the same kind of discipline you'd expect in modern forensic work. Who handled the object? When? Under what conditions? Could they have left their own DNA behind? These aren't nitpicky questions. They're essential to getting a reliable result. Then there's the bigger issue. Even the best DNA result needs context. If Calamity Jane's own birth year and early life details are debated, that tells you how incomplete the record can be. DNA doesn't replace history. It joins history. A genetic match would need to be paired with documents, timelines, and family trees built from actual records. Without that context, DNA can create new myths instead of killing old ones, because people will fill the gaps the same way they always have, with a better story. If DNA confirms a relationship, they'll build a romance around it. If DNA excludes a relationship, they'll claim the sample was contaminated or the testing was flawed. The desire for a certain story doesn't disappear just because science enters the picture. This is the strange loop Calamity Jane lives in. The West created her as a character. Dime novels and Wild West shows amplified that character. Collectors preserved pieces of that character. And now modern audiences want those pieces to act like scientific evidence. Sometimes they can, but only if the basics are solid. Only if the chain of custody is clear. Only if the questions are specific enough that DNA can actually answer them. Number 10. The secret in the silence. When you strip away the clickbait wording and the YouTube hype, the DNA mystery around Calamity Jane is really a lesson in how legends defend themselves, without anybody actively plotting anything, without any conspiracy to hide the truth. The legend doesn't need a cover-up. It has momentum. It has famous names: Calamity Jane, Wild Bill Hickok, Deadwood, the Black Hills, names that carry weight whether or not the stories attached to them are true. It has a famous town, preserved and promoted as a tourist destination, where the story of Calamity and Wild Bill is part of the attraction. It has a famous cemetery view, 2 graves side by side on a hill overlooking a town that barely existed when they were alive and now exists mostly to remember them. It has a stack of movies and books that trained people for over a century to expect a romance and a hidden child. From dime novels to Doris Day musicals, the story has been told so many times that it feels like history. Put those together and you get a story that feels true. Even when the documentation is weak, even when the timelines don't match, even when the only evidence comes from a claim that fell apart under scrutiny, what the more careful research keeps pointing to is something less tidy but more believable. Jane Canary moved through frontier spaces that were dominated by men. She found ways to survive through work, through connections, through sheer force of personality. She used storytelling as both income and armor, learning early that a good story could open doors that hard work never could. She attached herself to the same world as scouts, soldiers, cowboys, lawmen, and outlaws because that's where the work and the attention were. She wasn't trying to become a legend. She was trying to get by. The legend came later, built on a foundation of exaggeration and wishful thinking. Then, after her death, her burial beside Wild Bill Hickok locked her into a permanent double legend. That single decision, whoever made it, for whatever reason, shaped how every later generation pictured her. The graves became proof of a relationship that may never have existed. The markers became monuments to a love story that was probably invented. If DNA testing ever happens in a transparent, well-documented way, with clear questions and proper comparisons, it might confirm a family link. It might show that Jane McCormick really was Calamity's daughter, despite the problems with her documents. It might even show that Wild Bill was the father, though that would require exhuming his grave too. Or it might shut down the McCormick story completely, showing no genetic connection to anyone claiming descent. Or it might end up inconclusive because the samples are too degraded or contamination is too widespread. Any of those outcomes would be useful to historians, but none of them would erase the deeper reality. The Old West wasn't just a place, it was also a story machine. And Calamity Jane was one of the people it turned into a symbol. She became something larger than herself, something that served the needs of audiences who wanted the frontier to be romantic and dangerous and full of characters worth remembering. The grave on the hillside is part of that machine too, because it keeps inviting the same question, generation after generation. What if the bones could talk? What would they actually say? Would they tell us about a great romance, a hidden child, a secret love that survived death? Or would they tell us something quieter, something about survival and work and the endless performance of being yourself in a world that wanted you to be someone else? And would we actually like what they have to say? Or would we prefer the story we already know, the one that feels true, even if it isn't? That's the real mystery of Calamity Jane. Not whether DNA can answer our questions, but whether we're willing to accept answers that don't match the legend. The bones could talk. But would we listen?